Hello and thank you. On behalf of the Irregular Warfare Initiative, West Point's Department of Social Sciences, the Modern War Institute, and Princeton's Empirical Studies of Conflict, for joining us today for our virtual program focusing on irregular warfare and great power competition. One admin note, don't miss tomorrow's IWI event on terrorism and international order, in partnership with the Combating Terrorism Center. My name is Guido.Torres, and I'm the Director of Engagements for IWI.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Augie Dominguez, and I'm the Deputy Engagements Director for IWI. Today's program features great power competition, which has featured prominently in defense and security circles since 2018. However, today our panel of practitioners and experts will aim to explore and discuss how irregular warfare efforts figure in competition despite a shift in government and military policies towards high-intensity conflict.
The Irregular Warfare Initiative is proud to deliver relevant discussions to the IW community, especially to our fellow practitioners, researchers, and policymakers studying and adapting to an evolving security environment. For those unfamiliar with IWI, our mission is to bridge the gap between scholars, practitioners, and policymakers through events such as this, but also through our podcast, editorial content, and non-resident fellows program. We're a team of over 50 volunteers from many different professional backgrounds. We're passionate about the future of irregular warfare and putting research and solutions into the field.
For today's event, we are proud to partner with the United States Military Academy's Department of Social Sciences, and we also want to publicly thank our moderators and panelists for helping bring this event together.
Ladies and gentlemen, if you have questions for the panel, please submit your comments via Twitter, and we'll pass those to the moderator. The session is also being recorded and will be available after today's events through IWI's website and social media channels. As a final disclaimer, the views expressed today are those of the participants and do not reflect the official views of West Point, Princeton, or any other government or public institution.
We would now like to introduce our panelists for the discussion today. Doug Livermore is the Director of Communications for IWI. He's a Senior Intelligence Officer and the Director of Special Operations, Irregular Warfare, Special Programs, and Sensitive Activities for the Deputy Undersecretary of the Navy. Additionally, he is a Special Forces Lieutenant Colonel in the Army National Guard, currently serving as the Deputy Commander of the Maryland Army National Guard Special Operations Detachment, NATO. Doug is the National Director for External Communications for the Special Forces Association and is also a non-resident fellow with the U.S. Joint Special Operations University.
Colonel William Harris is an active duty U.S. Army Special Forces officer, serving as a U.S. Army War College Fellow at Georgetown University's Institute for the Study of Diplomacy. He has commanded platoon through battalion levels and served in multiple operational deployments in the Middle East. His current research areas include irregular warfare, especially as conducted by the People's Republic of China and Islamic Republic of Iran.
Edward Salo is an Associate Professor of History and Associate Director of the Heritage Studies PhD program at Arkansas State University. Before going to Arkansas State University, Dr. Salo served as a consulting historian for several companies under contract with the government. Dr. Salo is the host of the Sea Control podcast by the Center for International Maritime Security and a member of New America's Nuclear Futures Study Group. Currently, he is studying weaponization of heritage during war.
Alan Newton is a Department of Defense analyst and an adjunct lecturer at the National Intelligence University, teaching conflict analysis, while conducting ethnography for his PhD on the intersection of anti-Taliban resistance and social cultural frameworks. He taught at the American University of Afghanistan in Kabul to gain access to Taliban-controlled areas. He has authored articles and reviews in multiple outlets, primarily with the purpose of providing a population perspective to irregular warfare and political change.
Guiding the conversation this morning are Dr. Alexandra Chinchilla and Lieutenant Colonel Katie Crome. Alexandra Chinchilla is an Assistant Professor of International Affairs at the Bush School of Government and Public Service at Texas A&M University. She has a PhD in Political Science from the University of Chicago. Her research focuses on security cooperation and security assistance and proxy wars. Lieutenant Colonel Katie Crome is an active duty U.S. Army strategist, currently serving as a resident student in the U.S. Army War College's National Security Policy Program. Katie has served in a variety of strategic planning positions, most recently serving as the Director of Strategy and Plans at U.S. Special Operations Command Central. She has traditionally been focused on the Middle East, but is currently studying the Russia-Ukraine conflict and lessons learned for the U.S. Army. Katie, the floor is yours.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much to Guido and Augie this morning for kicking us off. So Alex and I are really excited to moderate today's panel with such a fun and diverse group of panelists. In today's geopolitical environment, There is certainly no shortage of issues to discuss with respect to irregular warfare and its impact on global power competition. We have a war in Europe, Chinese balloons over the United States, and ongoing strategic competition for overseas bases across Africa, the Middle East, and the Pacific Islands. This competition, against the backdrop of transnational challenges like the global pandemic, climate change, and the recent and devastating earthquake in Turkey and Syria, will continue to put pressure on great powers as they compete for global access and influence. Living in a world as complicated and complex as described requires critical and creative thinking from scholars and practitioners alike. We need a cadre of people that can develop and execute irregular warfare approaches to navigate this changing environment. People that understand irregular warfare and its global competition for legitimacy. We will now turn it over to this august group of panelists to begin walking us through their research. Doug, over to you.
Hey, thank you, Katie. Great to be here this morning. Appreciate the warm welcome. So I'm going to start off this discussion at somewhat of the macro geostrategic level, particularly as we've seen the United States shift through the last couple of national defense strategies, the 2020 Irregular Warfare Annex to the 2018 National Defense Strategy. There's been this marked shift from what we've seen as the counterterrorism focus of roughly the last 20 years of the global war on terror towards what we're phrasing great power competition, for lack of a better term. What we've seen as part of that shift is policymakers and legislators seeking to reduce engagement and investment in security force assistance, more of that traditional working by, with, and through, and enabling our partners, particularly in the developing world, to address their security needs, specifically as it relates to the threat of terrorism. However, what I've seen through my research and what I want to talk a little bit about this morning is the manner in which security force assistance provides incredibly cost-effective means of maintaining and increasing our influence in those key areas of the world where we see competition against the other global powers, Russia, and to an even greater extent and an increasing extent, China. For instance, we've seen on the African continent alone, the Chinese have provided hundreds of millions of dollars in security force assistance in the way of training, equipment, even transporting African military members to China to attend advanced training there on mainland China, as a means by which the Chinese have been seeking to increase their influence and supplant the United States as the partner of choice in the developing world. Now, as a response to that, I do think that it's vitally important that the United States continue to invest in security force assistance, particularly as it provides opportunities to counter what we see as growing Chinese influence and access in the developing world. Specifically, we can talk in more detail during the Q&A, but we've seen Chinese efforts in Zimbabwe, Djibouti, Western Africa as part of the whole counter AQIM, Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, and ISIS in the Greater Sahara threat, as the Chinese engage with the Malians, the Chadians, the Burkinabes in Burkina Faso, and so forth. Security force assistance, while combined as part of a more holistic American approach to engaging the developing world and providing for those very real security needs, serves both U.S. national interests in the sense that it addresses terrorism threat in its nascent stage before it becomes a global problem, but then also provides an opportunity for the United States to continue influencing, engaging both with these developing countries as well as with the Chinese, who we see increasingly engaging in these parts of the world. So I'm very much looking forward to the conversation, and I'll turn it back over to you, Katie.
Thanks so much, Doug. There's a ton of strings that we want to pull on there, but we'll get through everyone first, and then Alex will ask you a question. Over to Will next for opening comments.
Thank you, Katie. And I'm humbled to be here on this panel, have this great conversation with some people who have done some amazing research and thinking about some of these tough problems. As we think about really what strategic competition means, and in particular, sort of the political warfare and the irregular warfare aspect of that. And I'll just introduce sort of my piece is really thinking about the problem that I've been trying to research against. And as we look at what the People's Republic of China has been doing, and the researchers have looked into that, have described in great detail how over the past few decades, they really have done a lot of deep thinking about political warfare and irregular warfare in developing concepts for how they can conduct these concepts at the strategic level and leveraging the elements of their national power to accomplish this. What I'm trying to think about is how this might evolve in the future. If we think about the Cold War, thankfully the Cold War was not fought out in Fulda Gap, and it was fought out in the periphery between the ideologically aligned blocs. And so there's a high probability that what we'll see for any sort of strategic competition, again, it'll play out in the periphery. And that will take the form of political warfare and irregular warfare, being the armed component supporting subordinate plan for the political warfare effort. If we think about how China may evolve and get more deeply involved in this irregular warfare, one, we need to understand the strategic concepts they have for that. And I'm thankful that there's a lot of people who have done a lot of really good work on those concepts. But I think there's two steps that we need to do to take beyond that. The first one is taking a holistic approach to understanding the organizations, the doctrines, and the historical patterns of behavior for how the various agencies and departments and services of the PRC will actually execute the strategic concept, because the actual execution will not be the strategic plan that gets promulgated from on top. And so it's when we understand how those strategic plans may be promulgated and understood and executed by ministries such as the Ministry of State Security, the United Front Work Department, the PLA, the private military companies, which in China are all majority state-owned, especially, and then the PLA, with especially its intelligence and special operations forces. Once you understand how that internal dynamic, there's another dynamic, and that's the second step we need to look at. And if there's anything that the United States has learned or really relearned in the past 22 years of irregular warfare, is that the locals matter. The locals are the decisive element in any irregular warfare aspect. And so we have to understand how the efforts by the PRC and its agencies and departments and services will interact with all the elements, all the actors in the local country where they are. That's their official local partners, whether it's corporate or government or non-state actors. It's also the civilian population and all the various subgroups of that population, and then as well as the threat groups. And it becomes incredibly strategically dynamic and interactive as they compete for terms of physical combat and security, in terms of the fight for intelligence, which we have learned is a key portion of irregular warfare, as well as the political bargaining, which is another key, one of the three pieces: the physical combat, the intelligence fight, and the political bargaining that really make up what irregular warfare is and how it's practiced. So, and I think these two steps are needed to really estimate how PRC irregular warfare might evolve if and when they increase their level of involvement and intervention in places such as Africa or Central Asia, the Middle East, and around the world. And for us to have something to plan against, we need to take some intellectual risks and make some assumptions about how that might play out so we have something to war game against. Thank you.
Thanks, Will. That was great. Over to you, Ed.
Thank you. And again, I'm also very honored to be part of this, as I come from a history background and a heritage preservation background. And what I'm been looking at and wanting to discuss is the weaponization of heritage in irregular warfare. We, for the past 20 years or so, we have been worried about the destruction of heritage during military conflict, and the protection, and those things have gotten a lot of study and press. But I'm looking at not just the destruction, but the assimilation, how nations can use heritage as a weapon. Particularly, it's been done a lot by Russia in the Ukraine. Everything from taking museum artifacts and collections, moving in Russian museums, and changing the narrative and the interpretation to something as simple as in 2014, after they took Crimea, the Russians took everything off of the Ukrainian National Register and put it on the Russian National Register. So it all became Russian historic sites, thereby changing the narrative and taking away action, taking away the idea of Ukrainian nationalism by having a false narrative of it's actually all Russian narrative. And to me, this is important because these false narratives are part of a larger information campaign and can give other nations the ability to say, well, of course they're taking their territory, it was rightfully theirs. And then even further seeing this with China, China's been very involved in part of the Belt and Road Initiative, funding museums, helping preserve historic sites, which, on the surface looks like really, nice things. But at the same time, we're talking, the support is part of soft power diplomacy. And at the same time, some of these museums in Africa are being constructed with the size to be able to house artifacts that are currently in European museums, that the narrative is, once you get your looted stuff back. And, so to me, wanting to look at this as something that, we need to be aware of on the battlefield and how to counter it. So thank you.
Thanks, Ed. That's a really interesting angle, and we'll definitely look to pull that in later conversation. Alan, over to you.
How you doing? So my academic interests include social movements, chiefly the internal processes that social movements apply to adopt violence as an option of contestation, or alongside their nonviolent methods, which transitions a social movement from a nonviolent movement to a resistance movement against to force some sort of political or social change. So I look at identity framing, resource mobilization, local and external networking, political opportunities, and information sharing. I have a second research interest, and that's in how the US and China can engage resistance movements and then employ them as a third force in competition, be it against a state or another non-state group. There are some already case studies of third force in conflict and competition from Filipino and European resistance groups during World War II to the Anbar Awakening in Iraq. Some anti-Taliban groups in Afghanistan when we had troops there. And then the Ukrainian Ukrainian resistance groups since the US invasion. My third research interests tries to thread my second and third research subjects, and which may be more relevant to this panel is looking at new pathways for social science to inform questions that are important to analysis, operations, and policy. This may be important in understanding how local anti-China protests and sentiments along the Belt and Road Initiative just randomly occur. Not randomly occur, but organize. So basically, I do like to think about how to use empirical social science to deepen our knowledge about population attitudes and behavior, especially in the application of violence. Which means that I kind of want to move beyond conversations about human terrain systems, CIA Accords and Phoenix program, and the use of demographic data to inform policy. That's me in a few words.
Thanks so much, Alan. I think job security is good for you if that remains your interest.
It is very much.
And last but not least, over to you, Cosimo, to talk about something that is a little more technical until we get into the questions.
Yes, thank you so much. I'm really honored to be here. Just introduce myself. I'm currently a security researcher here at the CCDCOE, basically in tech branch. So I hope to add, another layer here in this kind of discussion and in this panel. So basically, the role of cybersecurity in irregular warfare. But basically, my field is mainly on, state actor, cyber state actor. So basically, my field is on advanced persistent threat. So what I understood till now, considering what it happened in Ukraine, is that the role of China and Russia was, for my impression, a little bit different. So basically, if the mainstream consider the role of China as a kind of ally for Russia, in reality, for the perspective of advanced persistent threat is a little bit different. So it happened that during different attacks we saw in Ukraine from the Russian APT, at the same time we had some interesting activity of the advanced persistent threats, Chinese advanced persistent threats, basically actors as Mustang Panda or Judgment Panda, that at the same time they didn't help too much the Russian advanced persistent threat, but at the same time they use their payloads, basically plugins or other malwares, to spy Russian intelligence and Russian agencies. And from my perspective, this is really interesting because we are seeing two main actors that at the same time they are a kind of, oppositor of the NATO that are not playing in the cyber field, they are not playing together. And for my perspective, it's really, really interesting. And I would also ask from your perspective, if it's the same in the other field at the same time, if it it could be improved in some way to understand exactly if these two main actors right now are cooperating or not. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much to all of our panelists. Thank you, Cosimo. I want to move to a sort of big picture question. You've highlighted a number of important topics that we're going to bring out in the rest of the discussion. But to zoom out, over the past 20 years, many people have begun to conflate special operations with irregular warfare, when doctrinally irregular warfare and political warfare are really waged at the strategic or government level. Although irregular warfare is executed at the operational and tactical levels, waging irregular warfare is a political decision intended to achieve strategic aims. So my question to you is, what are the strategic goals of irregular warfare? And Doug and Will, you've already touched on this in your remarks, so I'll just turn it over to Doug first, and then Will and whoever else wants to jump in. You're happy to have you on. Thanks.
Yeah, absolutely. So, and you kind of hit the nail on the head, and I had kind of alluded to this early on in my own comments, where we have seen over the course of the global war on terror very much a relegation in the minds of most major policymakers, particularly in the Department of Defense, of irregular warfare to special operations. A perfect example being the fact that, as we were discussing previously, there was the irregular warfare annex to the 2018 National Defense Strategy, which was written by the Office of the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Special Operations in Low Intensity Conflict over in the Pentagon at the Department of Defense. Having been involved lightly or tangentially in that process when I was working at ASD Solic, there was a lot of initial discussion about that annex first being scoped to the special operations community, but then a broader conversation, and then ultimately the annex that was published, and there is the unclassified version still available. It was actually expanded to the entire joint force. Because at the end of the day, what the goal of irregular warfare, as of the current doctrinal definition of irregular warfare, it's a competition for influence amongst the relevant parties. And therefore, it's not really it does not comport with the traditional concepts of conflict of armies on armies and navies on navies. It more what we consider traditional warfare. However, what we have learned, particularly as we look at how our competitors conduct irregular warfare, is that it's very much a whole of government approach. You see the entire joint force from our competitors, the Chinese and the Russians, as they do things like, as I opened with the security force assistance discussion, looking at that as a direct contributor to the attempt to gain influence, expand access, and build partnerships with other countries around the world. I mean, I think at the macro strategic level, we've kind of seen, particularly with the Russians as the Ukrainian war, as their war against Ukraine continues to devolve and go badly for them, actually then using what we would consider more special operations or low intensity conflict engagement with countries in the developing world to try to band together a coalition of the willing of countries that would actually still support Russia. And we've seen this going back to Will was talking about the private military companies, both the Russians, most famously Wagner Group, and then the Chinese also to a large extent have private military companies that conduct a lot of these activities, be it security force assistance, as a cover for influence activities with many of these countries in the developing world, specifically to try to basically create a competing bloc to the Western liberal order. So if we look at it from how does U.S. irregular warfare push back against that or compete with that, we see particularly, we have the irregular warfare annex. The new 2022 National Defense Strategy does not have an irregular warfare annex, but it's kind of baked into it. Talks a lot about working with partners and allies to support and expand the liberal world order in a way that maintains the rule-based system. And short of open conflict with armies against armies and navies against navies and air forces against air forces, irregular warfare is that space in which we compete in ways that are more nuanced and subtle, but then provide opportunities to borrow the Sun Tzu, the zenith of strategy is to win without fighting. And frankly, what we look at from an irregular warfare perspective is how can the United States and our partners and allies deter major competitors from their own malign activities. However, failing that, then are we positioned in a way to then defeat any potential aggression in a more traditional conflict? And then that's it for me. I'll hand it over. I know there's a lot of other thoughts here on the panel.
Hey, Doug, I think those were some great comments. And, I fundamentally agree with you in that it's a competition for influence. And that's really what we're talking about here. But to step back, I think we have to remember that there is an inherent goal in irregular warfare, if we really think about it, because the strategic goal is the political objective that's derived by the national command authority. And then everything else falls underneath that. Irregular warfare is one form, or really one logic, of how armed combat influences politics. It is if we think about conventional or high intensity conflict being somewhere where the combined arms maneuver has evolved to the point where the logic of that maneuver warfare has become a lot more dominant. You're fighting on sterile terrain, and then the politics is still present, but there is a much greater aspect on the military, the conventional physical fight. In irregular warfare, though, we see that there's you still have it's armed political campaigning to a large degree. And it's a logic of how clandestine groups, social movements, armed protest movements, insurgencies, various forms this can take, and what are the dynamics that affect how they operate clandestinely, how they operate within a civilian population, how they can influence civilian populations, both in control of the population, control of territory or not. How can they hide within the populace? How can they win the fight for information, intelligence, in terms of the dominant narratives, as well as information about what is going on in the civilian population, and the political intelligence that drives that. And then the bargaining between all the various aspects of the civilian population, the different aspects of any civilian social movement, the peripheral versus central political dynamics. All of those combine together to make irregular warfare this different thing that we're trying to wrap our heads around. And as we think about this, and Doug did a really good job of talking about how the PRC and some others have integrated this. And I think as I've been diving through lots of Chinese doctrinal manuals and some historical cases, you can see, one, that they are incredibly Clausewitzian, and politics permeates everything of how the PLA talks about how it's going to fight and how it actually fights. To the point, where the political commissar is coming all the way down, and there is no separation in their mind between military operations and politics. It's really an extension of Mao's thought and in the Chinese Communist Party's thinking about revolutionary warfare, political warfare that is since its founding. And it has not changed one bit. And so they have created mechanisms, and there's an assumption that all of their activities, from educating foreign leaders to foreign military sales to the private security companies and their operations in foreign countries, to all the development work, is pursuing the strategic line that is set by the CCP from up high, as that is the strategic goal they're working towards. Now, they have some gaps and issues in between. They have oversight issues, in One Belt, One Road. They've had significant oversight issues. They've had issues oversight of their intelligence operations historically. So they're not perfect. And I think the deeper we go into that, we can sort of see strengths and weaknesses, opportunities and threats, or how they approach that. All of those pieces. So thank you.
Yeah, Colonel, I just want to pick up on that, particularly around social movements and the population. And I want to bring it back to the goal of IW. Basically, I think that the issue is we have to look at the issue practically, I guess, and see who's actually informing irregular warfare and the irregular warfare strategy. We've, as a community, have relied too heavily on counterinsurgency theorists like David Kilcullen, David Galula, Ted Shackley, and even their Maoist counterparts too. So it's them informing how both operators engage the population, engage the environment, and then passing that information off to the policymakers too. So our sort of concepts and definitions are somewhat outdated, and sometimes operators tend to use more deterministic and essentialist concepts to inform themselves as well as the policymakers. So they tend to use, at least during GWAT, the Global War on Terror, concepts like the tribe, Shira, Whitebeards, when in reality, social humans in the field were organizing very differently, but were relating back to special operators or operators in the area in ways that those operators could identify, Western operators at least. So I think what's really missing, or like we had before the session started, is like some people and some professions are kind of left out of the conversation when we're talking about IW. There's a lot of planners that are informing the policymakers, not necessarily like analysts or actually academics too. That could be a starting point into understanding the goal of IW further. And that's my thought on that.
Thanks so much, Alan. And I know a lot of us have discussed this in the past, and it goes back to the importance of education of irregular warfare. And Dr. Seth Jones has a book out there called 3 Dangerous Men. And I think Kyle Atwell had him on a podcast earlier this year, or perhaps last year. And in that, it goes back to something Will said. And he looked at leaders from Iran, Russia, and China. And one thing that all three had in common was they studied the United States conventional warfare strategy. They got really, really deep into U.S. doctrine and then developed irregular warfare approaches from that. And that's something that the U.S. doesn't really do. We have practitioners and scholars that kind of look at large-scale combat operations or more the conventional side or advanced conventional weapons. And then you have people that study the irregular warfare or the special operations side of the house. And I think we initiated the conversation, saying there's two bends, the kind of big scale war and the people that look at that, and then the small scale war. So maybe I'll start with asking Will, what do you think is a good way to kind of bridge this gap? And you as a special forces colonel, you are steeped in this, and so of course you have to learn about it. What do your conventional peers, what do you feel like they're missing in their background with professional military education that they have a more difficult time coming up with irregular approaches that maybe our adversaries do not?
Thank you, Katie. And I think the book you mentioned is a great sort of segue for that, because a lot of it is really understanding the foreign countries and really diving into how they see the world. And it's ironic, even not only have all of those individuals studied our conventional doctrine, but all of them were responding to what they perceive as our political warfare doctrine. And something really that doesn't exist on our side, but they don't quite understand that. So they see and they are bringing together perceptions of how our NGOs and pro-democracy groups and all these other aspects, and they pull all this together and perceive a strategic coherence to it that we don't have. But they are attempting to understand us. I think really you have to dive in to the foreign countries, understand from the primary sources how they try and do it, and do your best to understand that culture in a way that has been difficult. I know if you look at our country back in the 1920s, really invested in Sovietologists and invested in having individuals really become area specialists in understanding Russia in its depth and to the maximum extent possible. And some of the graduates of that program are like George Kennan, sort of the architect of the containment grand strategy that drove how we approached the Soviet Union throughout the Cold War. But we don't have necessarily that depth. We don't have the foreign language aptitude or the drive and the critical mass of scholars really trying to understand that. The second aspect to that is that I think it really goes to what Alan was talking about, and that we don't have the terms and the understanding of irregular warfare, right? So we approach it in coming at it from what it might look like from the front page of New York Times and Washington Post, and they've got great people trying to do stuff, but that top level understanding is the perspective of the Western educated urban elites in the center of a city, not how things are happening in other social classes, not happening in the countryside. So we're missing that perspective. And we don't necessarily understand how social organizations come together, how they operate, how control and influence operates in different societies, how economics and information interact, and how the identities, the effects of military operations change the dynamics and the payoff incentive structures for local actors on the ground there. So it's a hard problem, but I think it starts with cultivating more focus on area specialists who can dive into this with the languages and deep cultural understanding. And two, it's really getting out and understanding, reaping the rewards of some really amazing field work that's in social sciences going on now, and furthering that academic endeavor. Thank you.
Excellent. So what I want to move to next is talking about that, picking up on that area specialty question. So both Ed and Alan in their work have looked at resistance movements and themes of nationalism. So what I want to talk about and kind of ask you about are the narratives that US adversaries, potential adversaries like Russia and China are using to mobilize and to shape the information space. So how do these states use narratives about shared heritage and irregular warfare? And is preservation of heritage really at the core of all these actions that Russia and China and other states are waging? Let's get Ed in.
Thank you. Yeah, preservation, heritage is one of those things that, and the destruction of heritage, we were talking about this in class last night, dates back to, the beginning of time. Destroying another nation's heritage is a way to, utterly defeat them. And we're seeing that in Ukraine and other places. But to me, like I was saying, it's the aspect of we can use the heritage, using it to help and to also serve as a weapon against our foes, because it can be as simple as helping preserve a site through money, through specialists, can bring goodwill, but at the same point, you have to be careful that it doesn't appear to be just another form of colonization, that you bringing in your experts, taking something. So it's kind of a double-edged sword. To me, it's a way that we can use the soft power to, help gain the influence, but also especially with the internet, there's so many ways to spread false narratives, to spread the false heritage. We're seeing this again, going back to Ukraine, where Russia's spreading all kinds of stories that Ukraine's historically not a country. It's always been part of Russia. And this allows, Russia's allies, the cloak of history to come under, that they can support, or at least not be against these actions, because, you have the false narrative that Russia's just reclaiming, protecting their own areas that's historically theirs. So, I was going back with sort of what Colonel Harris was saying. This is an important aspect and I totally agree with the idea of we need people trained in foreign area specialties. And in that, I think one of the aspects is to not only understand the history, but understand the heritage, which, is sometimes different. It's, what the people think is important. It may, it's the music, it's the folklore, it's the buildings, it's the foodways, all these kind of things that are important, and set a people aside. So yeah, I think that that's something that we can be doing, and it's something that's not, strictly a military action. It's something that should be done by the diplomats, whole government approach. So
Yeah, so I'll ask a follow-up question to, I think, bring in all of the panelists on this. So there's a lot of academic research about how the tactics that we were just describing of subversion are actually fairly easy for states like Russia, China, and Iran to do. Subversion, weakening a state, either pushing against a state or supporting resistance movements, can be fairly easy if you have this sort of indigenous desire to undermine the state. So what can we do to inoculate states against that kind of subversion? So anyone who would like to jump in on that, happy to have you.
Yeah, I'm happy to take a stab at it. I know, let me just circle back to kind of your broader assumption, which I agree with, which is that it's more difficult for modern liberal democracies with ostensibly greater government transparency to really engage in the information environment in a way that pushes back against our competitors, specifically like China and Russia. The advantage that the Chinese have and the Russians have is it's a very short, relatively bureaucratic, streamlined process by which a message goes from inception to approval to distribution. Rarely does it have to be true. More often than not, it's not. Obviously, the one example that we always, or at least I think most of us are familiar with, particularly in Africa and other parts of the developing world, was Operation Infection, which was the Soviet campaign to convince people all around the world that the United States invented AIDS. as like a genetic weapon. There are still parts in my travels, my deployments all across Africa, where there are locals that are absolutely convinced that the United States was responsible for AIDS, specifically to kill Africans. It's very hard to push back against that. And one of the challenges that we have, the closest analog we have in the United States would be the State Department's Global Engagement Center, which faces the challenge of relatively difficult bureaucratic processes to generate and approve and distribute messages. The other disadvantage that we in the United States and amongst our partners and allies struggle is that we have to be truthful about our messaging. Certainly, we have a pro-United States opinion, and that is certainly something that we would want to convey. But ultimately, at the end of the day, many of our engagements in the information environment have to be truthful, which certainly, going back to that old adage about a lie travels twice around the world while the truth is still lacing up its boots, that absolutely applies in this case. Where we have seen in the past some success in this space is that where we nest that messaging as part of a broader whole of government that combines the irregular warfare from the Department of Defense, combines with the sort of development assistance that we do through USAID, as well as back to the previous point that Ed made about the State Department and the diplomats syncing their activities with whatever that broader national strategy is. Really, real quickly, where we have seen this happen well in the past, really the last example that I can think of was the Defeat ISIS campaign under the Trump administration in the early days, where 3 days after the inauguration, the Trump administration issued a national security directive to all the departments and agencies of the United States government that said, come up with a whole government strategy to defeat ISIS. And that's exactly what we did. I was over at the Pentagon at the time at the Office of the Undersecretary of Defense for Intel, representing that office in the broader DoD effort, engaging with state, agency, USAID, Treasury, the entire government apparatus of the United States. And that was where we saw a top-down driven, NSC managed, whole of government approach to tackle a problem using all the levers of national power. And that's the sort of work that's the kind of oversight and emphasis that you need to be successful in irregular warfare spaces. And frankly, where I think that we will see our strategy going, particularly as you see things like the Irregular Warfare Center, which was established by Congress, really start to wrap their hands around this and see where we can push messaging, back to your original question, that is consistent with, but also persistent in a way that I think that we have struggled with historically, just based upon some of the inherent disadvantages that we find ourselves at.
Yeah, as a follow-on to that, Doug, and maybe over to Will on this question, I mean, I think that part of what we struggle with is perhaps because of us putting it in a separate bin, as in putting irregular warfare outside of the way we talk about traditional warfare, right? And it's in creating things like a center for irregular warfare, like we created Cybercom and things like that. When we place these things in stovepipes, does it sometimes make it more difficult for, the people that are focused on the everyday things in the Pentagon to think about that holistically? There's a lot of talk, those of us that have worked with special forces before, if you go to a conventional conference, it's at the end of it, it'll be an annex where, sprinkle a little bit of SOF on that, sprinkle a little bit of cyber on that when you're conducting planning, rather than it being kind of a central tenet of planning and operations. So, Will, over to you. Do you think that defining and kind of putting irregular warfare in its own bin hurts us at the end of the day as a defense enterprise?
Katie, thank you. It's a really good question. And Doug had a really good perspective on it too. And I saw some of that. I spent several years as a planner working on Syria and saw ups and downs in our integration for that. So one, building and establishing the Irregular Warfare Center, I think, is a great place to sort of cultivate sort of a critical mass of thinking about it. But there is a risk, right? There are no risk-free trade-offs in doing anything. So one of the things, the risk we need to watch is that it doesn't become the new annex to the campaign plan that's sprinkled on, but it's not informing the commander's intent or, the key portions of the scheme of maneuver in military parlance. So in the key to irregular warfare is that it's integration. And that's really only going to come, one, it has to be directed. You have to have policymakers who are interested in making it happen. And then you bring agencies together in the same room. And so we need to start building more linkages between State Department, AID, the intelligence community, and the military, thinking about how we're going to do these different aspects. Especially when it comes to if we're going to intervene or if we're going to help prepare a country for resistance against a potential aggressor or to inoculate them against subversion. Doing that, I think there's some good lessons to be learned, but I think it has to be learned together. And one of the things I'm here at Georgetown working very closely with a lot of foreign service officers, and it's interesting the cultural dynamics. Learning. And many times in too much, even today, after 22 years, there is still a large gap between the different silos of excellence in our government that we can do a lot of work to make bridges one person at a time. And as we do that, I think there's going back how we look at inoculating countries, because it takes a whole government approach. And military will play a subordinate role in a large portion, if not the majority, of all those activities. But there are some cases, Katie, I hope your work uncovers some of it, how Ukraine is actually successful in stopping Russian subversion to a large extent, weathering some blows against them and then doing it. So there's other cases that we can look at, such as the active measures working group that was during the Cold War. They did a very good job of countering and undermining Russian Soviet propaganda from a number of sources. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Will. And that goes back to just the proficiency that a lot of our adversaries really have in the gray zone. And I love at this point to bring Cosimo into this and all of his work on the coordination or lack thereof between Russia and China in the cyber realm. And I don't know if you could talk a little bit about that, and then perhaps any coordination or lack thereof between Russia and Iran in the drone and the UAS realm, and just kind of walk us through their proficiency in this gray zone and what they're doing technically right now.
Technically, the situation is quite complicated. So basically what we are right now observing between these two countries, that the coordination it's a little bit, tricky in the way that when you are, developing a specific exploit, is really, really difficult to, develop and coordinate at the same time the same exploit, or deliver the same exploit on the same target. And this is for this reason that this kind of actors, an example, China, Russia, but I could also talk for Iran. It's a little bit tricky to coordinate their activity together to deliver their payloads and basically target the same infrastructure, as an example. So it's really tricky in a way that when specifically an advanced persistent threat is deliver a specific payload, it could be detected by an intrusion detection system or an intrusion prevention system. So basically, right now, for a technical perspective, if there is a specific operation combined with another operation by another threat actor, it's quite easy that basically one operator is burning another operation by another threat actor. So for this kind of reason and for this kind of technical perspective, it's quite tricky from my personal point of view that this kind of actors can cooperate together in the cyberspace. And at the same time, it's quite also difficult to coordinate considering the language in the underground. So basically, most of the hacking community, we can call, yes, hacker community, stuff like that, are talking with different languages using, I don't know, specific memes, stuff like that. So basically, combine different culture from different hacking perspective in a logic of irregular warfare to combine this kind of activities, it's a little bit tricky. So this is my point about, and I would also understand if someone else has points and if we can discuss better on that. Thanks.
Excellent, thank you. So at this point, we have a number of themes on the table. We've talked about changes in the US government in terms of how we think about irregular warfare. We've talked a little bit about Ukraine and some of the new things that are kind of coming out of there. We talked about populations and inoculating them against potential adversaries that are operating in the space. So I want to zoom back out again and ask all of you about the last context of when we saw great power competition, which is during the Cold War. And so for a lot of us, this is kind of the default that we return to when we're trying to think about how great power competition is going to evolve in this space. So how is irregular warfare, as you see it going in the current context of great power competition between the US and China, how is this going to look different than the historical metaphors and analogies that we have from the Cold War or from the recent history of the United States being in the position of supporting governments against like very traditional resistance movements?
So happy to open up on this. I think one of the things that the dangers we keep falling into, myself in past years, is when we look at competition with China, we do kind of want to frame it in something that we understand. So I've written using Kennan's containment strategy as a potentially applicable in these cases. And I think that's a little naive to the point that you've raised with your question. The fact that irregular warfare against China in the 21st century is going to look incredibly different than how we combated the Soviet Union during the Cold War. For one, I'll just point out some of the differences. The Soviet Union, for all of its military strength and capabilities, really never posed a significant threat along the other, I guess I'd call them the other levers of national power. Their economy was always terrible. It could barely keep the Soviet Union supplied with the bare necessities, much less like become a true competitor to U.S. and other Western market access. China, on the other hand, and this was actually a comment that was made, I believe, in the LinkedIn thread. There's truly no daylight. There is no separation between the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party, and the state-owned enterprises that actually are economic powerhouses and have gained significant market placement in many places, in particular in the developing world. And that becomes an engine by which that money flows back to China, goes back into the coffers, goes into the military, gets reinvested through the One Belt, One Road initiative. So just the scale and the scope and the power of China as a potential competitor, I think, is much more considerable. Similarly, with the exception of the Soviet Union did benefit from having an ideology that was the communist ideology that was in direct opposition to where the rest of the free world mostly was sitting throughout the Cold War. But aside from a few countries where it actually took root, like Cuba, for the most part, it was not a particularly attractive ideology. Whereas the Chinese, through their communism or with Chinese characters or characteristics, it's a little bit more palatable and has been seen as something around which some of these other countries can at least coalesce and provide some international support, or at least like sell it to their own population, as in that this is a country with which we want to be allied and allow them to exert some influence over us. So I think that in many ways, what we will see in a quote unquote Cold War with China that we didn't see with the Soviet Union will be really this whole of government, full spectrum competition for influence in ways that we never had to deal with the Soviet Union. We talk about China's three warfares, specifically as they look at influence, they look at lawfare, they look at a number of approaches to engaging in irregular warfare that they do seamlessly, because there is none of that space between their private industries, their government mechanisms, that they're just able to going back to what we were talking about before, they're able to operate at a pace that's incredibly difficult for a modern Western democracy like the United States to compete with. So I think that as we look at steps on how do we compete better, like we talked about the Irregular Warfare Center that Congress established, as we look at a lot of the academic work, and like in my job over at the Department of the Navy, trying to find ways to integrate the entire joint force into irregular warfare. These are places that it's vitally important that we pursue this, because the threat or the capabilities of our main competitor, China, in this irregular warfare space are so much more extensive than anything that the United States faced during the Cold War against the Soviet Union. And we would be ill-equipped and ill-prepared if we were to really just like carbon copy that Cold War against the Soviet Union methodology on what we want to do with the Chinese.
Yes, and I completely agree with Doug. At the same time, what we can also say that basically, as Doug said, behind the Soviet Union, we had a kind of ideology. For China, it's quite different. Basically, also for advanced persistent threats, the target today is completely different. Indeed, in this irregular warfare, we had a lot of data about the fact that this kind of Chinese RPTs try to, get more information about the private sector in United States for a kind of economical advantage and a kind of superiority of their economy in face of US economy. So basically, APT, advanced persistent threats, Chinese advanced persistent threats had the target to get for the state some important data for some private firm in China. So basically, this is an important point from my perspective to just highlight the fact that the role of irregular warfare between US and China, considering the role that we had between US and Russia during the Cold War, is completely changed.
So I'd like to follow both. Doug and Cosmo did a great job really talking about the dynamics. And so picking up the ideological component, sort of the different system that they talked about. So one, the PRC is really offering in a coherent manner a different international order, that challenges how the international institutions that have been set up, that really large extent were set up during and after World War II. And they set up how diplomacy, economics, finance, all, and to some extent armed force all operate. And they're offering a different way to do this because they want a system that is more conducive to their interests and towards their internal stability. And so they are offering that. And so it's a comprehensive challenge, and they're using their economic levers really as enticement for that. And there's the Cold War, but it's too simple really to fall back on that as U.S. versus the Soviets, because I think one of the examples that really is the competition that was between China and the Soviets and the Sino-Soviet split, and how the PRC challenged the Soviets ideologically and tried to become the champion of what we call the global South, and really try to cast the Soviets as just a new imperial power. And that influenced how they conducted their regular warfare operations, how they supported rebels and revolutionaries across the world, especially in Africa, and in how really a lot of their efforts in Africa failed, and how it really clouded by the ideology. So I think there's a lot of interesting dynamics there. But another key dynamic, a lot of the conflicts we saw during the Cold War were shaped by other dynamics. I'll just name one. So one is the retreat of the European colonial powers. And so in the first couple waves of crises during the Civil War were really nationalist movements rising up against the retreating European empires. And we were on the side really of those colonial powers in a lot of places. And that changed the dynamic where it offered our competitors the opportunity to be a champion of the people in some of those countries. And we missed opportunities to become sort of working with the nationalist perspective, the authentic sort of indigenous voices there. And it was also that we sided with some weak partners. And so I think a key portion of this is that we have to think about not doing necessarily what we did in the Cold War, but focus on quality and focus on working with partners who are quality partners who have a feasible chance and have the willingness to fight for themselves. So we can help those. We can't really help governments that are not going to fight for themselves. And because in the last one quick change that's happened between the end of the Cold War and now is that the technology has changed. And technology is really changing in a way that really favors, to some degree, the irregular fighter, the guerrilla, the terrorist, the revolutionary, the rebel, because it is the proliferation of small arms weapons, of heavy weapons that are man portable, of clandestine communication technologies to allow that communication, clandestine financing means, and ways to organize clandestine organizations. All of these are helping these organizations, and we see it in Africa now, sort of really a resurgence of the Islamic State constellation franchises across Africa, and as they are able to start tearing away territory from some weak states. So these states they're facing some significant challenges, and the irregular threats that are independent and against the entire order really have a power that they did not have during the Cold War. Thank you.
So yeah, I want to pick up on what I think Katie mentioned, that use the concept of inoculation to gain advantage. And this does have some sort, it harks back to like intervention of foreign forces or great powers into society, into another state's politics, and even deterrence. It leads to another connotation of intervention by an external power. And to me, I don't necessarily believe that it's about intervention. It's more about partnering with the right local forces, or about finding the right partner in the area that will be able to and is willing to take up some form of resistance against China, against Russia. And basically what that means is we have to re-educate our forces, not only to irregular warfare, but how irregular warfare fits into our strategic goal of competing with against China and Russia. Because, you know, the PRC is PRC doctrine of three powers and unrestricted warfare doesn't think that way. It doesn't segment capabilities or even strategy to compete in local spaces, but they use our whole national power to gain influence, whereas the US and Western powers do that. And it's basically we're losing our competitive advantage in those small, tight spaces where it's not about the war, but it's about incurring cost at that point in a region that will force China and Russia to expend resources to maintain their presence. That's it for me.
Yeah, and I kind of wanted to go over Colonel, kind of taking what Colonel Harris was saying also, is we're dealing with the history of the Cold War. We're dealing with what the U.S. had done during the Cold War, you know, the partners that we selected, you know, what we did, you know, the outcomes of Vietnam, and you could take this even to, you know, the outcomes of in Afghanistan, with that we, you know, there's not just dealing with the decline of colonization and how we picked, you know, certain allies that may not have been the best deal. You know, we're still dealing with those choices today, and I think that that's something that China and Russia can definitely use against America on the you know, in that arena. And again, technology, yeah, it's, you know, spreading these false narratives are a whole lot easier now than, you know, in the 1950s and 1960s. You know, things can get around a lot quicker, and, you know, it can be made to look a lot more you know, official and professional. So yeah, I think that not only are we, you know, fighting different, we're fighting kind of with the baggage that we have from the Cold War.
Yeah, thanks, Ed. And, you know, trying to tie all of this together, a lot of it comes down to, you know, perhaps a classic interest versus values argument that, you know, a lot of us have in the classroom sometime, but in the workplace as well. And we as Americans just aren't that comfortable with things like misinformation, propaganda, aspects of hybrid warfare, because we didn't grow up thinking that that was part of what we were allowed to do when conducting or executing warfare. What do you think that we need to do? Maybe kind of starting with Doug. Now that the NDS, it directs us to start thinking creatively, and especially when it talks about active campaigning, and actively campaigning against this irregular type of warfare, this gray zone type of warfare. What do we need to do to ensure that our interests and values are balanced, and managed, and make sure that we stay in the right lane with United States war planning, but also to be creative enough to kind of tackle the complexity there?
Wow, yeah, that's a pretty tough question to try to start wrapping up on. But no, I mean, I think that there's certainly some areas where American values and interests are absolutely and easily aligned. Ukraine, not to spend too much time, you have a up and coming nascent democracy, or at least a democratic representative government in Ukraine that is being attacked by a totalitarian authoritarian regime. And that's somewhere where the United States is involved in irregular warfare, aiding a partner. Is absolutely, it's easy to align those two. I think going back to kind of what Will was talking about, and Ed to an extent, it's easy from our perspective to look back at the Cold War and some of the partners and allies that we made in the developing world, particularly in the post-colonial era, as certainly problematic in hindsight. I think at the time when you were talking about the Soviet Union and their partners and allies backing the regimes that we were opposed to, and certainly we didn't pick by today's standards and values the best partners. I think if you put yourself in their seat at that time, it's a little bit more understandable. That said, I think with that hindsight, or with that experience, we can certainly be more selective, or at least more honest, at least with ourselves and with the American people and our other partners and allies, where we are pursuing perhaps something that's more aligned with our interests versus our values. I think a perfect example of where we're kind of losing this fight. So Mali was a great example. As you know, they've been going through a transitional government after a couple of coups. The French just left, excuse me. But like Russian Wagner PMCs are in there supporting the government. There's, the Chinese are providing a bunch of aid. And that's a situation where, because the transitional government's values don't necessarily align with where we and our partners and allies, specifically like the French, are standing right now, it makes it difficult for us to engage with them. But we're losing an opportunity there to maintain and expand influence. So I think that in conjunction with our partners and allies, there needs to be honest, hard conversations about, in which areas of the world do we need to pursue our interest? In this case, be it suppressing Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, ISIS and Greater Sahara, groups like that, even if we have to work with partners that we might not necessarily think are aligned with our values. And then that comes when we start thinking about, like, how do we do that in an inventive and new way? That's where you look at opportunities for different incentive structures. Is it through USAID? Is it through diplomatic engagement through the state? Is it Treasury? Is it talking to the various international aid and development funds to find ways to incentivize our local partners in the developing world to pursue activities that are more aligned with our values, while still having those hard conversations and communicating transparently with our partners and allies and the American people to say, like, hey, we recognize that these partners are imperfect. However, because of these national interests, this is why we're going to continue to pursue these activities and these strategies.
So I think Doug hit it on the head. I would emphasize a couple points. One being the value of long-term relationships with partners on the ground. And that's where we can really gain influence, improve their capacity and capabilities, and really have some advantage in terms of actively campaigning in the irregular spaces. It takes that long-term perspective, continuous, preferably with the same American interlocutors who are the same partnered units, so you can build those long-term relationships on person-to-person basis. And bring that in with all of our whole of government approach there. But with that is that I agree with Doug, need to be honest. And so we need to be honest about the shortcomings of our partners, and be documenting that and reporting that up, and then be honest with the policymakers on where this is and why we're doing it, and that if you don't get involved with these actors, then the alternative is they're going to turn to somebody else. They're going to turn to someone else and get worse. So the alternatives, really, what we're talking about is, do we help them become better and become better able to serve the interests of their own people, and along the way help gain our national interests, or do we allow them to become under the influence of other actors? And then with that, I think it's important when we think about values and interests that we don't discount the value that our values actually serve our interests, and that we do get a significant amount of soft power coming from the fact that our news sources, that even government-owned broadcasting is independent, and that gives you a credibility with local actors in a way that other agencies that are wholly directed and following the party line do not have, cannot gain credibility with local audiences. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Will. We were talking a little bit with Alan before just about resistance movements. And then I think that previously Will also then talked about the difference between kind of partnering with forces on the ground and then what would maybe be lacking in partnering with institutions, and there's kind of a gap there, right? So we can pick a perfect partner and that can perhaps line for a year, a decade, 2 decades in some senses. But if there's not the institutions there to kind of back it up, if that person or partner or force goes away, it's difficult to kind of have a future that we are aligned with. So Alan, in all of your study of, researching resistance movements, what are some of the ways that you found are kind of most successful in getting that local population to kind of carry on after we leave?
So that's a very difficult question, because every time that the U.S. forces have engaged local resistance groups, they tend to fall apart right after they've reached their goal. Take, for instance, the Anbar Awakening, the tribal sheikhs who had organized collectively to oust Al-Qaeda from their territories immediately fell into like internal discohesion, basically. I think discohesion is a good word for that. That's because, they were vying for power in their national government. So as we empowered them, they also became more empowered to contest the national government of Iraq too. But and that's the difficult thing, because we, like I said earlier, we really relied heavily on counterinsurgency or counterinsurgent theorists to our understanding of irregular warfare. And because of that, we've relied on historical social organizations, which have always competed against the states and have protested against the state, have created some sort of level of unrest. I think the real issue is about creating enough, engaging a social group, a social organization that have already organized themselves, and creating enough tension between the local community and the population with the government to contest, PRC or to Russia, that will inevitably, it's difficult to talk about because the historical cases aren't there to show how these groups can continue on contesting. Well, what I'm trying to say is that there needs to be enough tension between the local population and the adversary, where it's more about perpetuating an identity frame to create tensions in the environment, I guess. It's a very difficult question. Thank you for asking, because I'm kind of lost in that question as well. And that's something that does need to get brought up in the future.
Ed, over to you.
All right, thank you. Yeah, I just wanted to kind of add, and goes back to our last discussion, this one too, is, it is the important aspect. I feel that, we need to also be meeting people where they are. Going back to the last question, the Fulbright program, of course, Secretary of State efforts of preservation, thinking about that are great, but, with new technologies, getting messages out takes different effort. And then the whole aspect of, dealing with people that may not totally align with us. I think that's one of those efforts where just honesty on both parts and can be really helpful. So, and I think, that going back to the idea of, preservation of heritage sites can be, I think, a really effective tool in getting people together for something that they can, they can bring them together, but also, these things, they cost money. You can put money in an economy and get people jobs, get them skill sets. I think those can all be really good tools that we don't think about, just not the information part, but yeah, you can take people off the streets, give them jobs and those kind of things. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, Ed. I wanted to go now to a question that we have from social media. It's an excellent question about the way that different actors like the West versus China or Russia view timelines for great power competition. So Western democracies can be more focused on shorter timelines because of the turnover between presidential and parliamentary governments. So how do we get our political leadership to take a longer term view, and how are our competitors thinking about their timelines of competition?
So yeah, real quickly, I think you kind of hit the nail on the head, and I don't want to spend a whole lot of time talking about how like Western countries, the United States in particular, think about it. But I do think one important point is, absolutely there's the political cycle between Congress and the White House. We lack the long-term coherency that our competitors like China and Russia have, which is certainly an advantage for them, I would offer. I will also say that from the U.S. perspective, the other challenge that we have is our procurement, our acquisition timelines, and the manner in which Congress plays a role in that. So the United States Department of Defense has to plan out 5 years in advance where do they see their capability gaps for use by the combatant commanders, and then how they're going to move forward as services to fulfill those requirements. Well, that's a 5-year process. Congress gets super involved in that, particularly when it comes to the interests of where these major weapon systems are built, where bases and other capabilities are going to go, to this extent that it actually builds into our system another level of bureaucracy and legislation that kind of impedes or makes it more difficult for the United States to both plan for long-term irregular warfare engagement, but then also stick to a plan. Perfect example would be like the F-35, all the back and forth and the level of congressional engagement there, and how that both helped the program go in certain directions that maybe weren't all that helpful, but also I think had some negative effects for the Department of Defense in the long term. And we see that across all procurement and acquisition, which in irregular warfare space is no different than that. I think it's also important to note now, shifting over to specifically to the Russians and the Chinese. In the Russian case, I think long-term irregular warfare planning has completely gone out the window. And we could have an entire panel on that discussion. I think that what we're seeing right now in the Kremlin is a jockeying for positions, regardless of whether or not President Putin is actually in ill health and on his way out. Like, he is an older man. He is going to be replaced at some point. I think what we see is this, like, the military is one actor that's trying to jockey to either replace him with one of their own, or at least have a major say in who replaces him. You've got the private military companies like Prigozhin with the Wagner Group, who also appears to be positioning himself. And then I think you have some politicians out there, like in the Russian Duma. And all to say, like, what we see in Ukraine is long-term irregular warfare going out the window, really a focus on short-term gains, maybe using some of the aspects of irregular warfare. We see all these asymmetric and indirect approaches. So I'll put that aside. But then when we look at the People's Republic of China, I think historically the way we viewed that is that because of the consistency and long-term stability of the Chinese Communist Party in a one-party system, they're able to pursue long-term irregular warfare better than us. They have more patience and consistency across a broader timeline. And I don't necessarily know that that's true anymore, particularly when you see some of these reports about the potential for China moving up reunification efforts with Taiwan to sometime before 2027. I think that's indicative of what we see as a shifting calculus in how the Chinese are viewing irregular warfare. You look at the Chinese population, it's getting incredibly older because of the one-child policy that they had in place for years. So like their pool of military age capable Chinese citizens is actually not looking particularly great over the long term. You've seen some of the economic downturn, some of it certainly helped by the COVID pandemic. And we see less buying power for investment into defense. And that will, I think, compress the window of opportunity for the Chinese to engage in some of these activities around the world, as well as some of the internal stability issues. We saw the protests against COVID. We've seen the issues with the Uyghurs, et cetera. So I would just offer that I think that the Chinese are viewing irregular warfare much less patiently than I think they historically have.
I'll just real quickly before I think Katie's going to jump in just a second, but yeah, so the Chinese in particular, no longer the Russians. Chinese do have a long-term perspective, but that also that means that they're less responsive to changing situations on the ground and less responsive to understanding local dynamics in a way that our less centralized and more bottom-up governmental approach and really how our whole society works can make us more adaptable. It's really made our country sort of an engine of innovation. So I think part of it is how can we build connections across the different stovepipes in our government to help build a common vision of where we're going and integration horizontally as opposed to the vertical. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Will. Alex and I were going to turn it over to everyone for kind of a lightning round of questions, but since the discussion has been so robust, we are running out of time. So we'll just pose some open-ended questions for further research, for hopefully a follow-on panel, and for people just to think about as they go through their day-to-day jobs. So we talked at the beginning about the strategic aims of irregular warfare as both practitioners and scholars. How do we really see irregular warfare fitting into conventional deterrence as we know it and have studied it? And how do we keep it alive at the institutional level? At a practical level, do we think it's possible to keep irregular warfare alive when most of our international, intellectual, and financial investment continues to be on platforms and people rather than how to employ either on an increasingly complex and complicated battlefield? So just a tag for education and all things irregular warfare. And both Alex and I really appreciate you guys attending this panel. And I will turn it over to Guido for final comments.
All right. I think we had a technical issue. In closing today's events, I'd like to thank our two extraordinary moderators, Dr. Chinchilla and Lieutenant Colonel Crone, as well as our panelists for taking the time to join us today and sharing their unique and valuable perspective.
The team at LWI aims to support the community of irregular warfare professionals by generating the Irregular Warfare Podcast, which releases every 2 weeks, written articles by members of the community, such as all of you, our Fellows Program, and of course, events like this today, to bring together the irregular warfare community to talk about important contemporary issues. If you haven't already, please sign up to receive our monthly email newsletter summarizing all this content.
Again, this session has been recorded and will be released on the IWI website and social media channels. One final reminder of tomorrow's IWI event on terrorism and international order. You won't want to miss this one. Please register using the link below. Lastly, I'd like to thank all of our attendees for taking the time out of your morning to watch. Your attendance and feedback help drive the content we produce for the community.